Hey guys, welcome to the first video on this channel that has absolutely nothing to do with my car. And that's because I went to a meet this past weekend and somebody brought a car that, as a Corvette owner, I couldn't help but pay special attention to. So here it is, check it out.
New ZR1. This is wild.
Biggest one in Southern California.
Still puts the cop car back there. Yeah, no, yeah.
She doesn't do that much. Ram and definitely she goes. She probably just kind
So of course, as you know, this is the brand new Corvette C8 ZR1. I'm not sure if this is true, but I heard this was the first one in Southern California, and one of only two currently in California. Definitely very surprised to get to see it in person, not to mention shoot it next to some airplanes and a vintage police car. So anyway, let's talk C8 ZR1. I'm going to start with the design. As you may know, the ZR1 nameplate actually first came out with the C4 generation Corvette. And even though that car was a record-setting performance car, it almost looked identical to the regular C4, even though it costs nearly twice as much. I think of it a lot like the Porsche 911 GT2 and GT3 cars. You know, the early models, the early generations, pretty much look very similar to the base 911s and the base turbos. It was hard to tell them apart. But as the generations evolved, I mean, look at the current GT3 RS. It's got a huge wing, decals, carbon fiber parts, a bunch of aerodynamic components, pretty much wherever you can imagine them. I think it's the same thing with the ZR1. You know, Chevy really wanted to make it clear that people know they're looking at the high-end variant and not just, you know, a base peasant C8 Corvette. Now, a lot of people might want to stone me for this, but to be honest, I've never actually been a huge fan of the C8's look. And it's definitely not an ugly car. It's just that I feel like Chevy hasn't quite mastered how to translate the Corvette design language to a rear mid-engine layout. And this is true with many manufacturers attempting to enter a new segment for the first time. Usually, when the second generation comes around, it'll represent a much more mature, much more well-executed design. And I think that's going to be true when the C9 comes out as well. But with that said, I think the C8 ZR1's design actually works really well with the base C8's design language. It complements the design language really well. It looks super aggressive, super mean, without being tacky or incohesive. And, you know, if you take the Corvette badging off and put some Lambo logos on it, I think you can fool a lot of people into thinking this is some high-end, you know, Italian supercar. Now, I personally don't know if I'd want a huge wing on a car if I plan to use it for the street, but, I mean, given the ZR1's level of performance, it's probably a car that's meant for the track anyway. So with that said, let's move on to performance. And this car's performance figures are unbelievable. The twin-turbo V8 makes 1,064 horsepower and 828 pound-feet of torque. Now, I know cars will always improve and evolve over time, but this is a Corvette just like my C4. And you know, the C4 has enough power for my taste already. And this ZR1, you know, it's also a Corvette, but it has 2.5 times more torque and 3.5 times more power. And it only weighs a few hundred pounds more. Now, I know the Corvette has always been a sports car with more of an American muscle flair, so horsepower has always been a big part of the equation. But it's one thing to have a car with a lot of power, and it's a whole other thing to have a car with over 1,000 horsepower. That's more power than a McLaren Senna or a LaFerrari or even a Pagani Huayra. And those are multi-million-dollar European hypercars that are worth much more than my house. And that brings me to probably the most controversial thing about the new ZR1, and that's the price. This car starts at over $175,000, and without any options. And if you want to get one anytime soon, the dealers are probably going to mark up the price by at least 2 or 3 Corollas. So you're looking at probably about $250,000 for a Corvette. And this is controversial because a Corvette has always been seen as a relatively attainable sports car with good looks and high performance for a reasonably affordable price. And last time I checked, $250,000 on a car isn't what most people would consider affordable. But here's the thing, Corvettes were not made to be affordable for the sake of being affordable, like an economy car. The Corvette has a very solid reputation for offering a level of performance usually found in cars that are much, much more expensive. And it's the comparison of price versus performance that makes a Corvette a bargain. The original C4 ZR1 definitely wasn't cheap, but it was one of the best performance cars in the world, and it was definitely much cheaper than the Italian supercars of the time, and not to mention also much more reliable. So to put the new C8 ZR1 into perspective, the Ferrari SF90 and the Lamborghini Revuelto both have less power, both are much less practical, and both start at around the $600,000 price range. So with the ZR1, you're basically getting hypercar levels of power for only a fraction of the price. So even though the ZR1 is essentially based on a Corvette, I actually think it makes more sense to think of it as essentially a whole separate model. Again, let's compare it to the Porsche GT3 RS. Some people think it's insane that anyone would spend $300K on a beefed up 911 Carrera. But the thing is, people aren't walking into dealers to compare 911 trim levels, only to settle with the RS at the end. No, people are intentionally choosing that car because they want to run with their friends who have Lambos and Ferraris and McLarens and stuff like that. And I think it's just like that with the ZR1. People don't just shop around for a regular C8 and then suddenly decide to triple their budget and upgrade to a ZR1. The ZR1 is made for people in a different tax bracket, and it's made to compete in a whole different league of performance cars. Yet, just like the regular Corvette, when you put it alongside its rivals, it's still one heck of a bargain. That's assuming you have an extra $250,000 sitting around. So there you go. These are my thoughts on the new C8 ZR1. As the owner of a C4, which is now worth less than some e-bikes, I definitely don't have a problem with the Corvette name being associated with a $250,000 supercar. Hopefully, down the road that's going to help boost the values of these unloved middle generation cars as well. But yeah, feel free to leave a comment. Let me know your thoughts on the new C8 ZR1 Corvette. See you guys next time.